thing now. You should look it up. Professional hobby horsing. There's actual races and everything they do.
There's so many like Instagram accounts that are like people acting like horses and jumping over stuff.
Professional.
Oh.
I was gonna show them professional hobby horsing.
Is that where you ride the stick horse?
Yeah.
I know.
Oh, I've seen that.
So disturbing.
Like 40.
There's a commercial where like this lady's having a party at her home, and then they go into the living room, and her husband is like jumping around on the stick horse, and she's like, "I told you no hobby horsing."
All right, are we ready to roll again? Yes, we are. Sure, why not? Why not? All right, so let's talk about digital cameras, the different file formats that we have. So your camera can record, the way it records onto the SD card is one of a couple ways or just one way. JPEG, TIFF, and or RAW. So JPEG, you guys know from Photoshop, is the most common file saved by our digital cameras. And it's compressed, so it's a little bit smaller size than other files, so you can get more per memory card, which is nice. It's the most recognized file for sharing. So you send a JPEG to your pen pal who lives in Siberia, their computers still know what a JPEG is and can open it. It's very universal. You do sacrifice some detail with JPEGs in theory, so always use the highest settings. And later when we actually look at your cameras, we're going to go into the settings portion and see what you have. And if you have JPEG settings of high, medium, and low, always have it set on high and leave it alone and don't think about it. The only reason that those other versions existed was, let's go back to the early days of digital cameras. I think I had a 16 megabyte card, and it cost a lot of money. It did. So if each file is maybe 1 or 2 megs, I'm not going to get a lot of pictures on my 16 meg card, right? So if I knew I was only using these on the web, I would maybe switch it down to medium or low quality so that it recorded smaller file sizes, right? And then I can get double or triple pictures. Not an issue anymore. So when we do look, if your camera allows you to set your JPEGs to be high, medium, or low, make sure you're on high and you stay there.
When you do that though, like if it's on high, couldn't you just do the 72 thing on Photoshop?
Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah, you can change it later. You wouldn't want to shoot, what if for some reason you were thinking, you know what, these are only forever and ever going to be on the web, so I'm going to do low quality. What's the point? You guys all have gigabyte cards. You have huge storage. It's not an issue anymore. And then, what if it's the best shot you ever took in your life, and it only can ever be this big? Can't be bigger. So yeah, take them at the highest, and then in Photoshop, you can always repurpose them for the web. You can optimize them and lower them down. So don't record on low quality. TIFF files, my first version of this camera, which was the EOS 10D, recorded in TIFF format. Okay, and that's how it actually recorded the files. And TIFFs are lossless, so JPEGs have some compression, TIFFs don't. Because of that, the files are larger and a little bit slower. The time it takes to write them on the card is a little bit slower. Not typically best suited for image capture, and almost now, does everybody's camera capture in JPEGs, I'm betting? Mine does now. I don't even have the TIFF option anymore in this. And this is a newer camera. So TIFFs are good for commercial printing of high output. So when you're sending things to a commercial printer, quite often you use TIFFs instead of JPEGs. And then the last version that could be recorded on your camera, depending on your camera, is RAW. How many of you are aware of what RAW is? And how many of you know your cameras can shoot RAW? Couple? My bet is if you have an SLR, you can shoot camera RAW. This camera cannot. A point and shoot that I have at home can shoot camera RAW. So it's not that you rule it out just because it's a point and shoot. So camera RAW, the RAW files are also known as digital negatives. So DNG.dng, that's the generic version. Canons, when you shoot in camera RAW, the extension they put on is .crw. Nikons do .nef, but they're the same thing. It's just that you need a Nikon camera to open it. If you put that file in here in my Canon, it would get confused. If you renamed it to a DNG, the generic digital negative, it works fine. So these are the highest possible image quality. Absolutely everything is recorded. When you take a JPEG in camera, it automatically processes it a little based on what Canon or Nikon or Sony thinks should happen. There's some degree of tweaking that's done. So Camera Raw does no tweaking. It records every ounce of data that's available there, all the detail in the highlights, all the detail in the shadows. And using Adobe Camera Raw, the software, which is free, and we're going to work with that in class, you can change everything as if you were still standing there taking the photo. So if you had the exposure wrong and your picture's too dark, you open it in Camera Raw and you bump the exposure up. Or you open up the shadows or bring down the highlights. You tweak it all on the fly, and it's using real data, and it's awesome. If you had your ISO set wrong, if you weren't paying attention, your film speed that we're going to learn about, you could fix that right in Camera Raw. How many of you shoot in Camera Raw? So you know about it. Yeah, it's awesome, isn't it? The thing with Camera Raw is you need to open it in Adobe Camera Raw first before you pop to Photoshop. So you wouldn't want to take, if you went up to the Packer game and did tailgating and had fun, took 50 pictures of your friends, probably wouldn't want to do that in Camera Raw because you have to open them in Camera Raw first. Do a little adjusting. Sometimes they need a little help, but they're awesome. You'd shoot those in JPEG. But if you're out taking senior pictures or a stunning landscape photo, why not shoot in Camera Raw if you have that option? Okay, files are much larger. Be aware of that. And they must be opened with special software. All right, memory cards. I would like you all to find the memory card and pop it out that you have in your camera. And if anybody has anything different than this, an SD, let me know. We want to talk about them.
128 megabytes.
Wow.
This is a 2003 production.
Can I see that?
Yes,
This is good. So this is, you have a Sony?
Yes.
All right. Perfect example. See this one? Sony memory. Sony has their own. Look at that bad boy. It's a rectangle. It's called the Sony. Huh?
How many gigs is it?
What'd you say?
How many gigs? It's 128.
128 megabytes.
It's a tenth of a gig.
Megabytes. Sorry.
There you go.
It's true, right?
I could only get like 20 and 50 photos.
When I bought my first 120 megabyte card, it was $128. It was $1 a meg. A meg. Now you're buying gigs for $9.99 at Walmart. It's ridiculous. So this is specific to Sony's. And when we go to, I'm going to have to bring, if you don't have one, I'm going to have to bring a card reading adapter because this will not be read by our Macs.
Why?
There's the slot in the back of our Macs is only for SD cards.
Okay, why? What's different with that one? Is that like an SD slide in or something?
Can you see it? How big it
like
is?
A chip or something?
It's a whole different format, different size, different everything. It wouldn't plug into that slot. So I have these readers that can read these. They can read compact flash cards, which used to be what all the SLRs use. Those are bigger and thicker, kind of like a matchbook.
Something to put it in?
Huh? Oh,
Is that
yeah.
An adapter?
Yes. And then how many of you have a card that looks like this, but there's a teeny tiny card inside it?
Slide it in,
Yeah.
Yeah, I got the adapter.
So those are even smaller. And is that, oh, you have it on your Canon? Really?
Well, it's one of the SD cards I had around the house.
Oh.
Actually, I lost my 64 gig one somewhere in my house
Okay.
right now, so this is what I'm using.
Yeah, because usually those small ones are Olympus or Fuji. I mean, they work. But you need a little adapter usually to get it to fit and to be read. The cool thing is that we do have SD card readers right on these Macs, and I do have the external USB thing that you plug in that you'll be able to use.
I have it.
Laptops almost always have this in them, built in now. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, not necessarily. You had to have an adapter, especially if you had a compact flash card. So, variety of sizes. Once they're full, guess what? You can download them and back them up and then wipe them out. You don't have to go buy new ones. Also, while your cards are out, put on your magnifying glasses and look on the front of them. And somewhere you should have a number inside of a circle. Tell me what you have. 10.
Number inside of the circle.
Anybody finding it?
Four.
4? Okay. I'm expecting to hear 10s and 4s, maybe something. 10? 4? Anybody have anything other than a 10 or a 4? Nothing?
This is really all.
Okay. So what that is, it's tiny and it looks like this.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Put the ceramic back up.
I said 32 on there.
It's in a circle that's almost full, like a letter C, and it's a number.
You need to put this in a microscope.
It is small.
I think your back is better.
It's under the HDR.
Did you guys find it?
Is your silver or gold?
Okay, what that means is that is the speed of the card itself. So a 10 is faster than a 4. So when you're buying cards, let's just say that I bought this camera because I like sports and it says I can do 15 frames per second, which means in sport mode I can hold down the shutter and it would go and it would take 15 shots per second. If I have a card that's a 4 speed, it may not be able to write to it fast enough or buffer it, and I might only get 8 of those 15 shots on here. And you can get mad and say that your camera lied and it's garbage and it doesn't work, when in reality, you just need a faster card. Okay? So if action photography burst mode is important to you, make sure you invest in faster cards. This is an old, they may be way faster than this. No, I don't know. This is the fastest I bought lately.
Where is it showing?
Right there. Yep, it's really teeny tiny. That's the speed of the card. So it's how fast things can record to it. And that's important in burst mode. All right, let's start talking about exposure and how we actually take a picture. How many of you, especially those of you that have the big camera, have left it on the green auto mode, at least for a while or most of your life? Now, a bunch of you raise your hands, and I have a feeling that you've experimented beyond this, but is that kind of natural, is to put it on auto mode until you get used to things? Especially if you've never heard of aperture, shutter speed, exposure, ISO, and all those terms freak you out, and people that know photography talk over your head on purpose and try to make you like nervous about it. It's nothing, we're going to learn about it today, and hopefully it makes sense today, but that's how we control and how we get off of that auto mode, how we try other things on the wheel or other things on the back of the camera. This little school camera, like that, Robbie, you have this exact model. On the back of it, it's so small, there's a circle right here, and if I push it up to the highest point, it's green and auto, meaning the camera's going to figure out everything for me. If I go to this middle setting, there's some scenes that we're going to learn about to use, and then if I go to the lowest setting, it's video, so I could take a short video clip with this. So even these cameras have auto mode and then beyond it. The thing about auto mode when you're in there is you have no choices. The camera figures everything out. If you want to do that flash fill on a sunny day, you couldn't do it. It would be grayed out, not an option. You need to go into off anything other than auto mode to get that to be an option. Setting or changing the ISO, can't do it in auto mode. You have to be in some other mode to get that option to show up. So the first of the terms that we're going to learn about is aperture. Anybody heard that term used, right? So aperture controls two things, how much light gets in and the depth of field. It's one of the things about lighting. So you can see this example over here on the right. It's showing the exact same image. It's on a tripod, and they took this at the same shutter speed, let's just say 1/400th of a second. But this one was on an f-stop or an aperture of 5.6. That and the 4 look like pretty good exposures. But as they made their aperture bigger, which is a bigger hole, more light gets let in, actually a smaller number, you see how too much light is getting on the sensor and it's blowing it out, right? As they made the aperture number get bigger, which means you're stopping out more and more light, smaller hole, even smallest, it's super dark. Not enough light got in on the sensor to make that exposure. So the one thing it controls is the amount of light that hits the sensor on a digital camera, or that would actually expose to the film in a film camera. Again, these numbers are a little backwards, maybe that what you're thinking, because the teeny tiny hole is a 16 and the big hole is a low number. But really think of it as The aperture are these blades that block light. And so at a 16, there's lots of blockage. Lots of blades of the aperture are there. Whereas at 1.4, hardly any of the blade is left showing. So I'm going to show you, before we move on to the depth of field part of it, I'm going to show you this video on lynda.com because they actually show this on lenses so that you guys don't have to take your cameras apart and see it yourself. Okay, the other thing that aperture does is it controls the depth of field, meaning what's in focus and what's not in focus. And the only way that you can get those shots where you see blur like that, either in the foreground and or the background, is by using a low aperture number. And not all of your cameras go down low enough for it to work, and sometimes you have to buy a lens that goes down to a really low aperture number to get this effect. But the smaller the aperture number, the more depth of field, the more blur you can get. So when you're open at, let's say, an f-stop of 1.8, that's quite a big hole. That much light is coming in. So two things that control your exposure is how much light gets let in the hole, and then how long these curtains are open that let the sensor actually be exposed. So your shutter speed and your aperture work together to figure out exposure. So on a sunny day, when you have a really low aperture, when you want that blur, like an f1.8, your shutter speed is going to have to be pretty darn fast because a lot of light is coming in. So it's going to have to be like 1/800th, 1/1000th of a second, really fast. But really good for low light. So when you want to let in as much light as possible, going down to that f2, f1.8, whatever, that's really helpful. These are great for portraits. So the only way you're going to get a shot where the foreground is blurry, it gets more and more in focus, and then eventually the background gets blurry. The only way you're going to do that is having a low aperture. So that number on your point and shoot cameras, again, look at the front of the camera. Just look at this one for kicks. I don't think it has any power to it, but on the front of the camera, on the point and shoots, right around this lens again by the zoom part, there should be some numbers. This one says 5 to 20 millimeters, that's the zoom, and then it says 1:2.8 to 5.9. Those next two numbers, after the 1 and the colon, those are the lowest aperture that this is capable of at the two different focal points. So when I'm pulled all the way in, and I am as wide of a shot as is possible, the lowest aperture number that this camera can go down to is the first number, which was a 2.8? Yeah. When I'm fully zoomed out at the farthest point that this one can go to, the best aperture I can get then, the lowest, is a 5.9. On your SLR lenses, on the front of those, you also have that information. So this one can go down to a 3.5 f-stop when I'm zoomed way back at 18 millimeters. When I zoom in, the farthest it will go, like that, the lowest aperture I can get is a 5.6. So on your zoom lenses, you have a range. On a fixed lens, you have a number. What number do you have? 2.8. 2.8, that's an awesome lens. That is a good portrait lens. So you can get a whole lot of blur using that lens. If you want that cool depth of field, you have to have a lens that gets down to a pretty low number. The other thing, and I hear this a lot with the point and shoots, so this one claims it can go down to a 2.8. The thing is that it also is dependent on the lighting that it's in at the time, because these cameras are guessing like what shutter speed should go with it. So depending on how much lighting you have available, your camera might not let you go down. The point and shoots might not let you go down to the numbers that it's capable of because there's it can't do a fast enough shutter, or there's not enough light to make it work. So, does anybody can you see on your cameras what you're capable of? Can you see on your lenses what you're capable of? Does anybody else go down to a low number on your SLRs? What's your lens capable of going down to? It's on the front.
is 1/3.
It should say 1 colon and then some
Yeah.
numbers. What's after the colon?
3.
3?
Yeah, and then 5, just 5.6.
Okay, so your lowest aperture is a 3 at that zoom back point, and you can go up to, or when you're fully zoomed out, the lowest you can get is 5.6. Okay. Everybody find it? Are you comfortable knowing? Yep.
I can't find
What is it, like the 1 colon 2?
It'd be on the front on here.
Yeah.
No?
There's nothing there, so when it doesn't happen.
Yeah, it does. I'll help you look when we have our quiet time. Not quiet time.
That's it.
Nap time. Did you find it, Rob? It's on the front of that one. How about you guys find it? All good? Okay. So, shallow depth of field, low numbers, low aperture numbers. A large depth of field, when you want everything in focus, you have to go with higher numbers, f11, f16, f22. That's going to be a smaller hole. It's going to let in less light, but more importantly, you can balance out the exposure using other tools like the shutter speed. More importantly, everything's going to be in focus. So for landscape shots, you want to go with these higher numbers. If for some reason, and I know you've seen this, maybe there's one flower in the foreground that you're focusing on and you want that to be crystal clear and all this beautiful landscape to blur, then you got to go down to those low numbers and lock in on the flower in the foreground. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, the other piece of the puzzle is the shutter speed. So how much light is let in from the hole, the f-stop, is one thing, but then how long either the film is exposed or the sensor on your digital camera, how long the curtains are open or the mirror is up, that's the shutter speed. So long exposure time means a long shutter speed. So let's be extreme and say 3 seconds. Click, click. That's extreme. Everything you do, all the light during those 3 seconds hits the sensor, and in a scene like this, it'd be way overexposed. Any movement you do is going to be exaggerated. There'll be blurs and whatever. Most shutter speeds that we see, like 400, 800, 100, 1000, are actually fractions. What that means is 1/100th of a second, 1/400th of a second. They're that fast. The only time, so whenever you see 400 as your shutter speed, it's really 1/400th of a second. If it's not a fraction, there'll actually be like quotations after it. That means 2 seconds, 2 full seconds. Okay? So again, it's quick. So when we want to freeze action, we need really fast shutter speeds, and when we want to blur action, we need slow shutter speeds, lots of exposure. So we're going to watch another quick Linda video, and I have to stop the recording. So like he said, if you were to take off the lens on your SLR, you can actually see that mirror in there. And if you have your camera on and you take a picture, that shutter or that mirror goes up and down. The thing that I kind of marvel at is that there's a mirror in here that's going up and down super, super fast, over and over, and knock on wood, I've never had a camera where that has broken. Like, think of any other time you're like, well, that's going to break someday soon. So it's pretty cool to think that they actually did a good job of making mirrors in there that the shutter can fire over and over. All right, so let's look at long exposure. So these are shots where your intent is to blur motion. Whenever you're in shutter speed, the only reason typically that you intentionally go into shutter speed or shutter priority on your camera is because your end goal is to either freeze action or blur it. So like sports photography, like Packer games, where you see those shots where it's right at impact and you can see like indentations in their face and sweat flying, those are milliseconds, super fast exposure. These are super long exposures, and all the light that was going on during that picture over the course of 3 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever, is being recorded. So the absolute only way you get these shots is to go into shutter priority mode and get these. So on your Canons, it's T, time value. On Nikons, it's S for shutter priority. On your point and shoot cameras, you usually find it in a scene mode. And for sure, the fast one is either sports. It's like Running Man is what the little icon looks like. That will do the best it can to freeze the action. Or sometimes it's kids and pets because they assume that they move around and they try to get the shutter speed to be fast. To get a slow, long shutter speed on a point and shoot camera is a lot harder because unless you have these 2 priority modes, time or shutter, depending on your brand, you can't intentionally tell it to be open for 1 second on most point and shoots. The best you can do is go like into a low light mode, like maybe set it for a dark or a candlelight or a sunset mode, even though that's not the case, and try to get it to blur your scenery. So those are kind of hard to accomplish. Anybody ever seen a photo like this? Okay. Anybody ever take a photo like that? Anybody ever try? And, okay, here's my first attempt 15 years ago. Isn't that cool? Come on!
Like a puddle.
It was this awesome river up in the mountains. I wanted the blurred stuff. It was like 5 at night, it was shady. I'm like, I'm sure I can do this. This was a 3-second exposure. So in 3 seconds, a lot of light hit the sensor and it's overexposed and ugly, right? It's horrible. So why didn't it turn out? What was wrong? What was the bottom line? Too much light, right? Too much light hit it. So too much light hit the sensor during this 3-second exposure. So how can I fix this? Shoot in dark conditions, which seems kind of odd, but dusk and dawn are going to be darker conditions. You can go out and take some of these pictures in low light. So if it's relatively dark and you leave your lens open for a few few seconds, all that light hits and it can work out. Another option is to use a neutral density filter. This one. And those are basically sunglasses for your lenses. And you have to buy these in the size that match your lens because they screw on. So this is a 72 size, and I realize the lens I have on right now is not. And it says the number of the lens. Good Lord, I'm blind. Somewhere. This is a 67 millimeter. So if I wanted to buy these, I would have to get a smaller one. There's a smaller one. 58. So they screw on specifically to your lenses. The cool thing about this one that I got, you can get them in different darknesses, or you can get this one that actually changes. And I'm going to hold it up here, and hopefully as I rotate it, you can see how it gets darker. You guys seeing that? So it's like transition lenses. You seeing that? Okay, that's different. That's it's not a circle polarizer, and it's not a UV. Does it say?
No.
Okay. So this, I would screw on the ends of my lens cap, and it's basically like having sunglasses. So if I wanted to try a 3-second exposure, I would make this dark, and I'd take the picture. And then I'd look at it, and if it's still too bright, I'd make my sunglasses even darker. Or if it's not, I would make the sunglasses lighter, for example. So these are awesome. If you're into this kind of photography, this is really fun to go out to like a running river and get those cool, the water, smooth and bubbly over. So, neutral density filter, that's this. There are some of these things that we can do later in Photoshop too, but this is how you would capture it on the scene. You would need something like this. If you're in an absolute pickle, say you're hiking in Hawaii and you're up at this waterfall and you're never going to be there again and it's high noon, if you have a pair of sunglasses, put those over your lens. Try that. It's the best you can do at the time. It's the same general idea. So neutral density filter can help. And the idea of shooting in dark conditions, if you again look on your screen, you can maybe see a little bit better. A student in my class, first year I taught it, took this shot at the Campbellsport Dam, and he went out there at 6 a.m., set up on a tripod, and this was a 30-second exposure on a tripod. He said people passing him looked at him like he was nuts because it was relatively dark. And here he is out with a camera. But he was able to get that cool water flowing look. You guys seen the pictures of the sky at night where the stars are a big old circle? Yeah, well, guess how they got those? Really long exposure because Earth does this. We don't realize it, but
It's like that fire hose.
yeah, that fire picture was probably a few seconds. Well, 1 second maybe, who knows?
Yeah.
You twirl pretty fast, right? But you needed it to be open that long. The shutter needed to be exposed that long.
Have you ever seen how like the underwater pictures are taken? Like where it's really dark? Like they set up like their cameras and then they leave it open for like 25 minutes and they go around with like flashlights lighting up everything.
That light painting is really fun. I did that once. Oh my gosh. So if you can get, I went a little crazy a few years ago when I was teaching this. I got all these gadgets on my own and I should bring them. But I got the thing that you can take a picture remotely, and you don't have to, a lot of them you have to be in front of it, like with your TV remote, you have to be aiming at it for it to work. This one you don't have to be line of sight, so you can be behind your camera and make it go off. But I was doing that light painting too with flashlights, and I had my family at night up against the barn, and I just was like painting flashlight light over them over a 10-second exposure, and it was really fun. Light painting, yes, look it up, it's a thing. It's very fun. So long exposure, shutters exposed for a long time. Short exposure, the opposite, is like sports. Freezing the moment, getting the water droplets. If you're going to be at 1/1000th of a second exposure, you need to have enough natural light for it to be a good exposure. So you can't really do these shots on a dark day or dusty day. They're just not going to work out as well. Unless you have an expensive lens, which is this thing. Or let's just say a fast lens. So to get a shot like this, couple things. Have you guys seen the sidelines of any, especially football, what the photographers have for lenses? They're $30,000 to $40,000 lenses minimum. So when I see those people getting run over by the players, I like worry about the lenses over the actual photographers. And they do too. They're like, protect the lens. Those are, besides being really big zooms and magnification, they also have low f-stops, like this 1.8. Because in order to get this, you're at, let's say, 1/2000th of a second. Therefore, you have to have a huge hole to let in a lot of light in that short amount of time. And then you also get all that blur, that depth of field stuff going on too. So I'll bring in and show you next week. I have a prime lens that's a 50. That I'm sure was a more expensive lens because it's a 2.890. I get that. But I bought, it's called a cheap prime lens, and if you are into photography at all with an SLR, a lens for $99 is cheap. Period. That's a cheap lens. This 50 millimeter that I got that's fixed, so it only is 50 millimeters, is a 1.8. So I can be, you get that awesome bokeh, that blur behind everything. It's a really fun lens to have, and it's $99. So if you want to experiment with something like that, that's a thought. All right, let's move on to scene modes. So I'm assuming based on the models you guys have told me, even those of you with SLRs have some options on the wheel up here beyond SPAM auto. Is that true? Do you have more options up here than that? Do you have like a Running Man maybe, or okay? Yeah. Does the more expensive and the more high-end professional grade your camera is, the less things are going to show up here, believe it or not. A really expensive Canon, like the Mark series, is going to have aperture priority, shutter priority, manual, and I think automatic or program mode. It has 4 things on the dial. They assume you know what you're doing if you have that camera because it costs a lot of money. The body alone costs a lot of money. So on mine, I have a lot of other options, and I want you guys to look. So if you have an SLR, look at your dial first. If you have a point and shoot, you need to go into the scene mode. So on this little camera, it's the button other than auto. If I move down to that and turn it on, I start seeing scene modes. On some other point and shoots, there's a button that's scene, and you got to get to that. So on this camera, besides aperture, I have auto, program mode, shutter speed, aperture priority, manual, custom, no flash, portrait, landscape, macro, sports, night photo, and movie. Those are all the different things on this wheel. So scene modes is where your camera is doing a lot of the thought process of what kind of settings you need to get the best option. So on a point and shoot especially, when you go into scene modes, you often see a frame like this. You guys familiar with this? So portrait mode is one that we'll see a lot, and we'll talk about when that's super useful. The mountains are landscape mode. That's super helpful. Running Man would be sports or freezing the action, so a high shutter speed. Anytime you see this flower, and you'll see that a lot, that's macro mode. That's extreme close-ups, not 2 feet away, it's like inches away. A person with a star like this or over here, that's night portrait mode. And the cool thing about this, have you guys ever taken pictures of your friends outside at night, like in a situation where there's pretty lights behind, like maybe Christmas trees or the state capitol's all lit up? Your flash goes off, they're lit up super bright, almost white, and it's pitch black behind them. Like you can hardly see what went on behind them. So the reason is the shutter speed was synced to be open as long as the flash was open, or flash was on, and that's it, and then it stops. In this mode, it lets the flash go off, but the shutter stays open even longer after that to expose more light, so any of that ambient light is still hitting the sensor, and then eventually it shuts. So then you get an image where your person is lit up with the flash, but you still get that pretty ambient background of Christmas tree lights or the state capitol all lit up or whatever. Okay, so that night portrait mode, you've never tried that. Sand and snowman. The common theme here is very bright scene. Lots of white snow, lots of white sand. You're going to see next week how the light sensor, the light meter in your camera, reads it, and it's like, this is too bright. This can't be normal. There's way too much brightness coming back. I'm going to fix that by dimming it down. And a lot of your winter pictures with snow look dingy and gray. That's one way of getting around it, is changing to the snow mode or the sand mode. This one, you'd want to look up for sure. I think this is like indoor party mode where you think you're inside with different lighting. Fireworks, it'll know how to get the best fireworks picture. Is it a long exposure? Is it a short exposure? But how do I get a short exposure when it's pitch black at night? Like, how do I do this? It'll help figure it out. Sunrise, sunset will also do proper exposure times and apertures and warm up the reds and oranges a little bit. And how about this one? It's a museum or a church. What rules do you think that employs? No flash. And therefore probably low light and handheld, so it would do whatever it can to help you get the best picture there. This is important for those of you that have the point and shoots. If you only have an option of this, where there's an arrow going up and then it says ISO, we're going to talk about this at the end of this PowerPoint, but the ISO is the film speed or the sensitivity to light. If you can't actually set that to be a number on your point and shoots, this might be your only way of getting a high ISO, is to go into the scene mode to get it. So just be aware of that. All right, so there's a bunch of explanations. Again, this PowerPoint is all on Blackboard, so you can go look at these. So one thing I want to mention is your camera's manual. If you're like me, you kept it, but you don't know where it is. It exists, but you don't know where. So I want you to be able to find your manual, and if you can't physically find it, that is not a problem at all, because what you can do is go to our friend Google and type in the exact name and model. So I'll attempt to do it with this one. This is a Canon PowerShot SD940IS manual. And it's going to take me to different places where I can find the exact manual for my camera. If you show me your camera's manual, the physical one, or you at least, not at least, if you print out this front page, you don't need to print out all 700 pages, and show that to me, you get 5 extra credit points. I want you to know where these are, because when I start saying, like, okay, bracketing, my camera doesn't have that. Is that true? And I've had students say, and maybe not bracketing, but it was something that I was 99.9% sure any camera would have it, and they just flat out said in this worksheet, I don't have that. They didn't look. I Googled their camera, I pulled up the manual, and sure enough, it was there. It exists. So do this. And the cool thing about if you download a PDF is you can use that search capability. You could type in bracketing. Do I have bracketing? How do I make my camera bracket? So knowing where your manual is really important, and I want you to be aware of that and find it, use it, print it out. Print out that first page for sure. All right, we're going to push through the last two topics in this before we start looking at your cameras to really figure things out. So, talking about ISO, what is that? That used to refer to the film speed. The actual speed of the film that you would buy would be 100, 200, 400, maybe 1600, and that's how sensitive it was to light. So, you always want to use on your digital cameras where you can set your ISO. So on this camera, I have a button up here that I push for it, and then I rotate this wheel to change my ISO. On other cameras, you have to go into menu items and find ISO and then arrow over from 100 to 1600 or whatever. You have to find it on your own camera. What it does on our digital cameras is that it makes the sensor more sensitive to whatever light is there. So this amount of light would be intensified fourfold, for example, way brighter than it really is. Because it's basically taking existing light and magnifying it, it turns it really grainy and ugly. It's high ISO pictures are going to be really grainy and not the best. So you always want to use the lowest ISO that you can. On this camera, I leave it on auto. I let the camera figure it out until there's a time that I know I need to specifically do something different, and then I take over. So always keep it at the lowest possible number or on auto where your camera's going to, like on a sunny day, it's going to keep it low, like at ISO 80 or 100. This video it's kind of hard to see, but I hope that on your screens in front of you, you can actually see this.
The ISO number refers to the sensitivity of the recording media to light. An ISO of 100 requires more light to expose properly than an ISO of 3200. The higher the ISO number, the greater the sensitivity, or in other words, the less light required for a proper exposure. There is a trade-off, however. While lower ISO settings will require more light, image colors will appear much cleaner and have less digital noise. Sensors using higher ISO settings will be more sensitive to light, but there is also a greater amount of noise.
Can you guys see that
Take a look.
on your screen, how it's kind of pixelated and noisy?
Look at these two pictures of a dark shadow taken on different
So that's actually a picture of a shadow. It's not just a black screen right now.
ISO settings. The first is at an ISO of 100. The second is at an ISO of 3200.
See that difference? It's the exact same shadow or sheet of black paper taken at ISO 100 and then again at ISO 3200. So any light that existed, it magnified and faked over and over to the point of complete ugliness, right? That's terrible.
What is supposed to be black is grainy and unpleasing to the eye. This is the result of high ISO settings. Ideally, try to shoot at ISO ratings of 400 or less. However, some camera sensors, such as Canon's, produce acceptable images at higher ratings depending on what you are shooting. A number of different ISO films are available for film cameras. However, with digital sensors, the ISO really refers to the amount of artificial boost the sensor has. What this means is that the sensor becomes more sensitive to light, but only does so because of an artificial electrical gain added to the incoming signal. It's not clean light, it's amplified light. This is why noise artifacts become visible at higher levels.
All right. So an example of this that I can share with you that's a real life example, a friend of mine just didn't buy into this fact that ISO made that much of a difference, whatever. So told him, go outside, take a picture of the moon. So it's midnight. Auto ISO or a low 100 speed is that shot on the left. And then I said, okay, now go into your ISO and crank it up to the highest number you have. He had 1600 as the highest option on his camera. Took the exact same shot. This is the moon at night. Nothing changed with the ISO.
See, that's cool.
This is not a day
I
shot.
tried to do that, dude, and I could never. I always ended up with that picture of how to do that. That's cool.
Well, this is, I mean, it's weird because that's not what anything looks like at night, right? But that's the point of how much it magnified the existing light of the moon to make it, to prove to you that whatever existing light was there, it could magnify and make brighter. So the exercise that I'm going to have you try, and we'll talk about this in a second when I give you your full homework sheet, but you're going to practice ISO settings. And you're going to show me a dark scene at a low ISO and as high as your camera will go. So for those of you that have numbers and you can go from 100 up to 3200, I want those two extremes. For those of you that have the point and shoots, you're just going to have to take a picture in a normal camera mode and then go into your scene and go to that high ISO scene and take that same picture again to get the other version of it. Now, here's the trick, because I've had people not pay attention to this and their ISO examples were terrible. You can't go out today, right now, and do an ISO 100 and an ISO 800 out there and see this extreme. There's plenty of light out there, right? This is not the time to do this. When I want you to do it, and the best way you're going to see this, is think about at night. Now, it's light until 7-ish, but at a certain point in your house, you kind of hit that point where I got to start turning on lights, right? So maybe 6:30 in your dining room, living room, whatever. Don't turn on your lights. It's dark, right? It's that point where you're getting annoyed. Take a picture of your Gatorade bottle on the kitchen counter in a dark setting at ISO 100, and then crank up your ISO to 1600 or whatever the highest is. Take that exact same photo again, and it's going to look like the lights are turned on. Okay, that's the extreme. That's how I want you to test it and prove to me that you get it. Does that make sense? Do it in indoors at right before you start wanting to turn on all the lights in the house. That's the best time to practice this. No, it doesn't. You can go outside at that same hour and take some shots, but it's where it's like, this is too dark. This is never going to turn out. And then find out, oh, it did. So the time that I intentionally change my ISO to a high number is if I ever take a camera to a concert, because the lighting in concerts is tough, right? It's almost always pitch black where you're sitting, but the stage is perfectly lit. But they're moving around fast. You don't want, all my first pictures were blurs of the people going across the stage because the exposure was staying open too long. You have to get that really high rate of speed to freeze the action, which means you need a smaller aperture to let in as much light as possible, but then whatever light is there, you want to digitally amplify it. So a higher ISO improves my pictures. Just remember, when you're done doing that, go back to normal ISO. Go back to auto or 100 or get off of that scene, because then if you go take this shot right out here at 1600 or 3200, it's going to be all white, blown out, way too much light, amplified, okay? So that's going to be one of your exercises that I have at the last page. That's the homework. Bracketing we're going to get to in some other weeks, but some of your cameras will have this feature built in where your camera will automatically take 3 shots. Whatever you set it up to do for the correct exposure, it'll take the first shot like that, but then it will take one right after it at a slightly darker exposure and one right after it at a slightly brighter exposure. And in the days of film, whoever shot by film, did you ever do this? Were you intentionally, you were pretty confident of your exposure settings, but just to be sure, you opened up the f-stop 1 stop more or 1 stop less to get more light in so that one of the 3 prints would be accurate. That's what bracketing is. And then later, we're going to use all 3 of these to make one of those cool HDR shots. We're going to merge them in Photoshop, and we're going to get the perfect parts of the proper exposure. We're going to get the perfect parts of the darker exposure, so maybe there's some more detail in the sky or in the clouds. And then we're going to get the perfect part of the exposure in the bright points, where we can see detail in the clouds or in the shadows. So this is what HDR on an extreme can look like. Crazy and wacky. It can also look very realistic. A lot of the real estate photography right now, indoor of houses, is done this way. to make sure that you can see the detail everywhere, okay? So again, on your camera, these are some of the things that you might see. So when would you intentionally go into aperture priority mode? What would be your reasoning for that? It's not about controlling exposure in this case. It's about controlling, depth of field, blurry background. So if you want everything in focus or not everything in focus, the key here is that you have to go into aperture priority mode if your camera has it. If you want that blur, you have to use the lowest f-stop that your camera will let you do, and that's how you're going to get that depth of field. If you're working on a point-and-shoot camera that doesn't have this option, or you're kind of afraid of aperture priority, you could also try this portrait mode. And that's going to give you, if you lock in on the face with that halfway down shutter and then finishing, that's going to give you the best shot of getting this in focus and this blurred, if there's enough behind you. I've had students take a picture to practice this. They put something right here on a table, and then they stand right here and they try to get blur. They want the wall to be all blurred. There's only 2 feet to work with here. You don't have a lot of room unless you have a really good lens. You're not going to be able to blur this. So for some of you, go out, be outside, go out on this path, have your friends stand 50 feet down there. You stay here, and you've got lots of stuff behind them to blur out, and then zoom in on them, and that's going to put the background in a blur mode using these other features, if you can't control the aperture with a number. Okay? So this is your option on the point and shoots, usually. If you want everything in focus, on an SLR, you're going with a high number, 11, 16, 22. On your point and shoots, you're going into mountain mode. That tells your camera everything should be in focus. Make sense? And on your Nikons and your Canons and your Sonys, A or AV is almost always what it's going to be, aperture or aperture value. The cool thing about being in aperture priority mode is that you set the aperture on purpose to control your depth of field. The camera figures out the rest. The camera picks the shutter speed that will best match that to get a good exposure. You only have to consider the one thing. When you're in shutter priority mode or time priority mode, you determine the most important thing here is that I freeze action. So I want 1/200th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. You tell the camera that, it automatically figures out an aperture that's necessary to make it work. So you're picking one as the priority, camera's doing the rest. And then of course there's M, manual mode, that's where you do everything. You pick the shutter speed and the aperture, and in that case you have to know what you're doing, or use the light meter built into your camera and still know what you're doing. All right, when you're going to intentionally switch to shutter priority mode is when action and motion is what you want to control. The one time you switch to that mode, you want to freeze it or blur it, fast or slow shutter speed. So TV is time value, S is shutter value on Nikons, and Running Man is like the sports freezing mode, fast mode on a lot of point and shoots, or on even some of these cameras, there's a sport mode. Another cool thing when you switch into sport mode on a camera like this, the Running Man, is it also does that. It shoots in burst mode because I'm on Running Man mode. It kind of knows that I want to be in burst mode. Versus, I also have a burst mode that I can change up here, that I can say, when I push the shutter, take one shot, or when I push the shutter and hold it down, continue taking shots. Running Man puts me into that mode, that burst mode automatically. Okay, the last detail is white balance. And who has changed the white balance in their camera? Who is aware of that? Okay. Do you guys understand that white isn't all the same? This version of white is not the same as this version of white. You see that difference, right? Ladies that have ever seen the makeup mirrors that you can change from outdoor to fluorescent to whatever, all the different lighting things, that's how different lighting changes. And the most dramatic one that ruins our pictures is fluorescent lighting. It's horrible. Natural lighting is your friend. This stuff is horrible. So the reason that we need to consider this and possibly switch our white balance on our camera, and your point and shoots will have this also, is to get this proper white balance. So here's a picture. If you leave it on auto or as shot, this is what you get. Daylight and auto tend to look the same. Where it starts doing things to fix your white balance is when you get into other extremes. So on a cloudy day, or if you're in the shade, if you guys can picture what that would look like in your pictures, usually they're lacking some contrast and they're kind of grayish or bluish because you're in the shade and cloudy, right? Your pictures are kind of flat. So when you switch into cloudy or shade white balance, it warms up your pictures. It adds some yellow and warmth to them. Tungsten, fluorescent account for the icky fluorescent lighting or the yellow fluorescent lighting, the yellow bulbs inside your house, the normal light bulbs, incandescent. So here's some examples of white balance. So without changing, let's say this is in a house that has all the incandescent yellow bulbs. This is kind of what you're going to get in camera without changing it, but really they're more white and gray. They don't have this yellow cast. So by changing the white balance to be what your conditions are, you're going to get a better picture in camera. You don't have to fix it. This picture, I want you to pretend that it's exactly the same mountains and same view, and that it's taken maybe 20 minutes apart. Can you tell that this top one has less contrast? It's a little bit more flat, not as pretty. This one is better. What's different? Let's say the person was not paying any attention, never changed any settings on the camera. 20 minutes later, they get this better shot. Any guess why? Or what's different? Like if you had to do one of those. Huh?
He moved.
I'm saying pretend he didn't move. Pretend it's the exact same vantage point.
The sun come up a little bit.
Nope, still sunny. You ever do those things with the pictures, like what's different? And you go, oh, there's a cat here, but there wasn't in this picture. So you circle the cat because it's different. What's different? Clouds. Specifically, white fluffy clouds. There's actually some white in this picture, and the camera was able to recognize, oh, here's some white. I kind of know how to balance things now. So this helped with the natural white balance that the camera automatically chose just because there were some white points in it and it could reference them and balance out on its own. Whereas this one, there's no real white. So clouds are not always your enemy at all. So when you find your white balance on your camera, which you will, these are going to be what the icons look like. So they're going to be in menu settings, or on the SLRs, quite often they're a button on the top. It says WB. So auto is what you typically are going to shoot in. Daylight, I don't ever bother with because auto's perfect. If it's a really cloudy day or a shady day, I might switch, or I'm in shade. Tungsten, I don't do a lot of indoor shots with tungsten, but fluorescent, let me tell you what, if you ever go to a gym and take pictures of a basketball game, volleyball game, anything like that, have you done that and got them back and they're horrible? They're very yellow. This is when, especially, you would want to switch over and get a better shot.
Because of the lighting?
Yeah, because of the fluorescent lights. Definitely, and I'll show you actual samples in a second. So here's the different icons. The thing is that when you're done being on a special setting, like when I leave the gym, I have to remember to go back to auto, because if you take pictures in fluorescent setting and you go outside on a sunny day, it's going to ruin them. It's going to take out the yellows that the fluorescent lights would give you, which you'll see. So you got to remember to go back, bottom line. So here's an example of white balance. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty confident that the correct version of color is the one on the left, because the white trim looks very yellowish in this one, right? So if you found a catalog and it looked like this in one and this in another because they didn't have their white balance set right, and you bought this chair thinking it was this color and it showed up like this, would you be mad? It's a big difference because they had the white balance wrong. It's not realistic. The lower version shows a shade as taken with no, like just normal, versus they put it on a white balance of shade, and notice how it warmed it up. It added some yellows into it. This one is labeled incorrectly. This should say fluorescent. I gotta fix that. Huge difference, right? This is what it looks like. They're clear cups. They're not yellow cups. And then snow also, how I mentioned they often are really dingy and bluish. This can change the white balance a great deal. It can really help with that. So there's 6 pictures on 6 different white balances. And definitely some are better than others. Some look white, some look yellow. One looks blue. A fun thing that you can do with white balance too is use it in camera to do a creative shot. So you can take what is a blue sunset and make it purple in camera, not have to do it later in Photoshop. So just for fun, every now and then, you could change your white balance and see what you get for a creative purpose. So here's my example of being inside a gym. Sitting in the exact same place, the only thing I changed was the white balance. Which two of these can we rule out right off the bat? We know they're wrong. Which one? This one's bad, right? What else is bad?
I've been
That
in
one's
that gym
bad.
before.
And then this one's not so great. Kind of dingy. This is probably the best one up here, right? If you were to guess. So those are just the different white balance settings. Now, the other option that you can have on your cameras, depending on what kind of a camera it is, come on, good grief, this version, the custom version. On my Canon, it looks like this. It might look like this icon. Doing a custom white balance means it's specific to whatever lighting you're in at that exact moment. It's customized for that moment. So there's 2 ways of doing it. One is this lens cap that you can buy fairly cheap that has this like white bubble sensor, and you have it over your lens, and the first picture you take is that. And that is the point of reference that your camera is going to use in the custom mode to set it up for the remaining pictures. You take that sample shot in the lighting you're in, so I would take it in here. Cheaper and easier way is you bring along a sheet of white paper to show what white looks like under these settings, and you have your subject hold it. The thing that this photo would be better is if this center point was more on her white sheet of paper, because you really want to meter the white sheet of paper to see how it looks in that setting. So you take that picture, then you switch your camera to the custom white balance setting, and it says, okay, what photo do you want to use as a reference point? And the last photo that you took pops up, and it would be that one. And you'd say, yes. And then from there on, it balances your shots based on that custom white balance. So in that same gymnasium, here's the white sheet of paper, here's the exposure I got, the area behind. They're like, I don't know why I'm holding the white sheet of paper, she's weird. But that was the custom, and then this was the shot I got right after it. And look how much brighter it is. There's no flash, nothing changed. Just the custom white balance. Okay? All right. Let's explore these features on your own camera. And what I want to do is, who are the Canon TI6s? Raise your hand. There were like 4 or 5 of you. Okay, the Canons. All Canon people come up here. Nikons, who are the Nikons?
Canon.
Canon's up here. Nikons, go back there somewhere, maybe in those center rows. And then Samsung, Kodak, Sony, you're actually going to be fairly similar. Why don't you guys go that way? So Canons, Nikons, everybody else. I want you to find if your camera, not if, I know you do, I want you to find the flash. I want you to find how you would take a depth of field picture that would allow for blur. I want you to find your ISO and change it. I want you to find your white balance and change it. Okay? So sit together because there's going to be lots of similarities and some things I want you to look for. How would you take a limited
That's what I got.
depth of field?
Stop, Sylvia. I'm laughing at you.
You're over here, Mark.
I know, but that just reflects it off me. Anyway. Bro, come on, man.
Oh, C.
I have a great video ago where she took
Oh, I got a camera in my hand.
$300 camera, and a $3,000 camera, and
Well, how does it?
I didn't think they were that.
Like,
I could see the differences, but I didn't think they were $3,000 different.
Because like this thing's apparently a whole shot.
Not the screen. I'd rather stand.
Because she wants us to find. I know what a flash is.
Yeah, that's.
I think it was like so it'd be like aperture priority. Yeah, I'm still working on that down. Like by the time my daughter, like I've done senior pictures for 2 kids.
Okay,
and,
so these are a few of the few things I want you to look for on your camera. How do you do this? So you're either going in the menu button and you're finding things, or you're going in the scene mode. Those of you that have point and shoots, I want you to go into the scene mode. And I want you to find what you have in there, what's available to you. How are you going to take a limited depth of field picture? How are you going to go into blur? So in other words, do you have aperture priority on your camera, and how low of a number can you get down to? In this room with the lighting, it's going to be hard to tell if you're actually looking through your camera. Your lens will give you a more accurate answer. If you have an SLR and you can get everything in focus, you're going to be also in aperture priority mode, but you're going to be at the high numbers. How are you guys going to control motion? How are you going to freeze it and blur it? What mode do you have to be in? On your dial, if you have it on an SLR. Shutter priority, yep. So those are going to be shutter or time value. If you have a point and shoot, you're probably going to be in running man mode, sport mode, or low light to get the blur. You have to think what's going to work on your camera. Make sure you know how to change the ISO and the white balance, even on your point and shoots, because this is something you're going to have to do. So, are you finding stuff?
No.
Well, I have like a small one.
Okay.
I have.
I need big, big glasses to help you.
So
It would be better because like I have.
Aperture priority is always better.
Okay.
Sport mode is good because of that burst mode, like if that's intentionally what you're doing. But if you want to get blurry depth of field, go here and use a low number. Go here and use a high number.
Okay.
Yep, ignore
So
these
always.
other options.
These are always better.
They're always better. Yep.
Okay. And that's, I guess that's, yeah.
It's probably going to be in a menu. You're going to have to rotate through these menus and go up and down to find it. And okay, here's another thing. When you guys say, how do I find my ISO? I can come over and try to help you, but get your manual or find the PDF of your manual and look for ISO, and it'll tell you, go to menu, go to settings, arrow to this. All of your answers are going to be in that manual. So you probably can't control this stuff, right? And it shows up. Just take a still frame.
Freeze frame?
Do you have an actual camera?
No.
No. Then you are going to need to hold cameras. So, let's see. This one needs card, however. If you found all these basics, I want you to keep looking around, like go into your menu button on those and see other things. Like see the JPEG settings, the small, medium, large, find that. Make sure you're on good numbers there.
Touch the screen, bro. It ain't that old.
So Rob, you're not going
This
to
is
need
the
that.
flash bills where you just force the flash to be on.
Yes.
Okay, so this one has a memory card in it. Actually, I'm going to clear it out. I think it's in one of those pictures, so I'm going to clear this out. And then I'm going to have you sign something saying you're checking it out.
Okay.
So,
Other things just say